Matt Gajewski here with Awesemo.com. Back again to discuss the 3 keys to this week's MMA DFS slate. Make sure you hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and hit that notification bell so you know when this video and all others go live. Also, we've seen a ton of upsets in the past couple weeks. Leave a comment, let us know who is the fighter with the biggest upset that's going to break this slate. Now, highly anticipated main event here. Anthony Smith versus Alexander Rakic. Both of these fighters coming off a loss, looking to avenge that loss. But this is a 3-round main event, not a 5-rounder. Big impacts for DFS, which we will discuss. We are going to talk topic number 1. Which fighters do you want to target in DFS? High upside fights. Topic number 2, navigating chalk. How do we navigate the most owned fighters on the slate? And 3, where can we look for some sharp leverage off that chalk? First things first, the most aggressive fight on this card that we need to discuss. Magomed Ankalaev taking on Ian Cutelaba. Magomed Ankalaev, he's 9K on DraftKings, $19 on FanDuel, 1.6 times on SuperDraft. Cutelaba on the run back, $7,200, $12 on FanDuel, and 2.4 times on SuperDraft. This fight's extremely aggressive and highly likely for a finish. It is the single best prop on the slate, plus 205 to go to decision. It's a rematch. Ankalaev already won this fight. It was a first-round knockout, but it was very controversial. He appeared to rock Cutelaba early in the first round. The referee steps in way too early. Cutelaba still clearly defending himself, but calls the fight, hence the quick rematch. And the line has changed drastically. That first fight closed at Cutelaba plus 185. Now Cutelaba is plus 290. That is over a 100-point swing in the betting line. And outside of just the overall aggression, we love the props. It's probable for a finish here. Ankalaev, 62% finish rate. Cutelaba, 92% finish rate. 4 of Ankalaev's 5 fights at the UFC level finished early. But Cutelaba is the more aggressive fighter overall. We just look at strikes. He lands 5.29 per minute compared to 3.46 for Ankalaev. Cutelaba also more takedowns, 2.59 on average to Ankalaev's 0.68. Ankalaev does have some things in his pocket, though. He's very good on defense. 67% striking defense, 85% takedown defense. He's won the striking battle in all 5 of his UFC fights. That could give Cutelaba some trouble. But what we can really come back to, Cutelaba is super aggressive. He's going to push the pace here, and he's going to draw Ankalaev into a more aggressive fight. If it doesn't end early, which it is likely to according to bookmakers, this fight still should be aggressive enough to score well in DFS, and that's why we want to take a look at it. Fight number 2, Maki Pitolo taking on Impa Kasanganay. Pitolo, 7,700 on DraftKings, 16 on FanDuel, and 2.05 times on SuperDraft. Kasanganay, 8,500 on DraftKings, 17 on FanDuel, 1.9 times on SuperDraft. Pitolo should be popular here. He is just a plus 100 underdog at 7,700. That's very nice. But we're also dealing with an aggressive fighter. Pitolo lands the 5th most strikes, 4.95 per minute. Lands the 6th most takedowns, 2.27 on average. Kasanganay, he looks great on paper, but he's a super green fighter. He's a guy that has only been fighting professionally since January 2019. That's evident in some of his fights, although he does have an undefeated record. Pitolo remains a heavy-handed fighter, a guy with a lot of knockout potential, and he is plus 210 in the distance. Like that line a lot. On the other side, Kasanganay is also aggressive. Minus 120 favorite, lands the most significant strikes at 5.53. He's actually tied with Sean Brady, who we'll get to later. But he also lands the 5th most takedowns, 2.5 on average. And while Kasanganay is green, Pitolo puts himself in some of the worst situations in MMA, highly questionable on defense, 54% striking D, 42% takedown D. And we saw his kind of unawareness of surroundings in his most recent fight. He loses via first-round submission to Darren Stewart. Now, Darren Stewart has 18 professional fights. That was his first submission win over Pitolo. Pitolo landed the takedown, put his head in a bad spot, gets guillotined, and that was that. But either way, this is a must-roster fight, I think, just because of price and then the overall aggression we're going to see between these two guys, also likely for a finish, could be in the optimal, very good chance that it is. Last fight we'll talk about that is very aggressive is Sean Brady taking on Christian Aguilera. Brady's 9,300 on DraftKings, $20 on FanDuel, and 1.5 times on SuperDraft. On the runback, Aguilera, 6,900 on DraftKings, $10 on FanDuel, 2.4 times on SuperDraft. Brady's the most expensive fighter for a reason. Minus 400 in the betting markets. I don't agree with that line. but that's what he is, and he's going to be owned because of it. Regardless of the line, this fight is going to be aggressive. It's hard to gather information on Aguilera. He only has one fight in the UFC. Fought Anthony Ivy. It was a first-round knockout. Aguilera was able to do it in 45 seconds on only 10 significant strikes. But if we look back to his time on the regional scene, he's a guy known for his boxing. He has 14 victories, 11 of them were knockouts, and 10 of them occurred in the first round. Also has a background in wrestling, which we know scores well in DraftKings if this were to go to a decision. Still on the other side, Sean Brady, he only has 2 UFC fights. They came against questionable competition. One of them is no longer in the UFC, and the other has lost 4 out of his last 5 fights. Still, Brady, tied with Kasung and I for the most strikes landed on this card, 5.53. Lands the second most takedowns, exactly 3 on average. This is a low-level fight, but because of the action we're expected to see, I think it's a must roster for DFS, and I do think Aguilera is a live underdog here. Not likely he wins, but if he does, good chance he's in the optimal with a pretty good score. Next topic, we have navigating chalk, topic number 2. And we need to start here with the main event, Rakic taking on Smith. Rakic is $8,700, $23 on FanDuel, 1.6 times on SuperDraft. Smith, $7,500, $18 on FanDuel, and 2.35 times on SuperDraft. Not only do I think this will be more owned because people could perceive this to be a 5-round fight, but it has a lot of name value. Rakic and Smith are well-known fighters in the industry. Rakic is minus 270 as the favorite. He should carry some ownership because of it. And Rakic is the more aggressive fighter at first glance, but he still is only landing 4.17 strikes on average. If we look at Smith, only 3.19 strikes per minute. Takedowns, Rakic is at 1.20 compared to Smith's 0.45. Smith is a black belt in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, so don't take him lightly on the ground. But when it comes to fights and it comes down to decisions, Smith often isn't aggressive enough to end up with good scores or even win sometimes just because of his overall non-aggressive style. We saw him lose the striking battle in his last 4 fights. I think this makes him somewhat reliant on the finish. That's semi-likely here. This fight is plus 140 to go to decision. And Smith, 33 wins. He's finished 30 of those early. Still, Rakic has never been finished in his career. I think just with the overall non-aggressive style, there's a couple other fights that we already talked about that are more aggressive than this. If you think this goes to decision, it could be one to get a little different with. I mean, it's a solid fight, but it's not a must roster for me. Considering the ownership, a fade could be warranted in your high-risk contests. Another fighter that's going to carry extreme ownership, we already talked about him a little bit, but we're going to reiterate Ankalaev here. Again, 9K on DraftKings, 19 on FanDuel, 1.6 times on SuperDraft. We discussed the upside here, but we didn't discuss that Ankalaev is a minus 350 favorite here, and he has the best prop in the distance at minus 135. He also won this fight already, so guys that are just hunting box scores and looking at surface level information, highly likely to click Ankalaev's name. Even if you just think Kutalaba wins this fight, that could be a spot to get different and maybe some chalk to avoid. But overall, I do like this chalk more than some others just because of the overall aggression. And then Sean Brady at 9,300. We already discussed this fight at length again. Minus 400 favorite, but that's an interesting line. Of course, the lines drive pricing here, and that's going to just result in some high ownership. I do think he's also some pretty decent chalk just because of the overall aggression. But if you're looking for some leverage, I don't think Aguilera is a terrible play. With these 3 being so expensive, you can't roster all 3, particularly on DraftKings. That should keep ownership relatively flat between them. Initially, we had Alex Caceres, who was supposed to fight Giga Chikadze, and Chikadze dropped out. Caceres just 7,400 and 13 on FanDuel. I thought we could see, one of these late replacement fights where we get a huge favorite at 7,400 in Caceres, but I just want to touch on the late replacement in Austin Springer here, who is now Caceres' 3rd opponent. Springer is actually fresh off a submission win over Giga Chikadze himself, is 12-3 and 3-0 in his most recent fights. Also has a very strong strength of schedule on the regional scene. We don't have lines out for this yet, but I just want to touch on this. I initially thought we'd get Caceres as a huge value that might allow us to take 2 or 3 of those really expensive chalk fighters. I actually think that we might get a line that's closer to a pick'em, if not even Springer being the favorite. That's going to lead us to some weird ownership across the board. Ownership should be flatter, and we're going to have to take a look at some guys like, Neil Magny, Emily Whitmire, even some underdogs here. And I think a couple guys that we should at least touch on their ownership. Neil Magny, at 8,600, he could be a guy that people pivot to just because he's also a big favorite. He's minus 235. And, he's only $100 more than a guy like Kasanganai, who's just a minus 120 favorite. Magny's fighting Robbie Lawler. Magny holds a 4-inch height advantage, 6-inch reach advantage. This fight does lack a lot of upside here. Magny only lands 3.95 strikes per minute. He's a good grappler. He does have upside there. But on the other side, Lawler has just not been in the most aggressive fights. 3.57 strikes per minute, 0.71 takedowns on average. That's not great. And that fight is minus 215 to go the distance. They're both mediocre scores in decision. So if people are interested in that fight for DFS and Magny carries ownership, that's a good pivot spot, I think. Also, I do think we see Emily Whitmire with some decent ownership here. She's a minus 140 favorite in that 8,200 matchup against Polyana Viana. This is probably, like Whitmire, Polyana Viana should be where the Impa Patolo fight is priced, but it's not. It's at 8.2K. And if people are trying to roster those fighters at the top, Whitmire could be someone that people look to. Again, not the most aggressive fight. Whitmire lands just 2.84 strikes per minute. Viana's at 3.89. These are two of the least accurate strikers on this entire card. The betting line here should drive ownership. It's not the most aggressive fight, so I think it also could be a potential fade. And then two other fighters that are cheaper that we might have to look to just with the chalk at the top. Alessio Di Chirico. This was a complete error in pricing on DraftKings in particular. He's 7,800, 17 on FanDuel, 1.95 times on SuperDraft. Going against Zach Cummings, who's 8,400, 15 on FanDuel, and 1.95 times on SuperDraft. So you can see DraftKings in particular made an error pricing because Chirico is a minus 120 favorite at 7,800. That should put him in play just based solely on the betting line, even though this is one of the least aggressive fights on this card. So if Chirico does come in with ownership, which this betting line indicates he should, I think it's a good fade. I'm more than likely to fade just based on the mediocre score and a decision win over anything. And, in our tournaments, we do want to target upside, which brings me to overall leverage. There's a couple good spots for it. First one I think you can look at, we have Ricardo Lamas taking on Bill Algeo. Algeo is a replacement fighter, but Ricardo Lamas is at 9,200 on DraftKings, not priced on FanDuel, 1.6 times on SuperDraft. Algeo on the run back, 7K on DraftKings, not priced on FanDuel, and 2.35 times on SuperDraft. People are going to look at Cutelaba. They're going to look at Sean Brady at the top. And now this Ricardo Lamas Algeo fight is not aggressive, at least compared to those two. Lamas is still a minus 310 favorite here. He lands only 2.88 strikes per minute and 1.63 takedowns on average, but this is a huge spot where we can get some leverage in the betting markets. This fight is plus 105 to go the distance, and Lamas is actually plus 110 for an early finish. Assuming we do get this early finish, Lamas is going to be a pretty decent pivot off those fighters at the top, so I actually do like him for leverage here. And of course, if we get an Algeo win at 7K, very good chance he's in the optimal. A couple other fights that we could potentially look at for pivots. Mallory Martin taking on Hannah Cyphers. Mallory Martin, another fighter with just huge upside as far as betting goes. She's a minus 345 favorite over Cyphers. This fight, however, is minus 225 for an early finish, but I still think it could be sneaky for upside. Both of these fighters have significant negative striking ratios, and Cyphers has been finished 5 times in 6 losses. So maybe Martin can secure a rare finish here. Still, both of these fighters only have 50% finish rates. I think if you're looking at Martin specifically, she does also have takedown upside, averages 3.53 on average. That's the most on this slate. Cyphers only with 66% takedown defense. She's allowed a takedown or been submitted in 5 of 6 UFC fights. There's some opportunity cost with Martin at the top. You're likely taking a stand, maybe fading a guy like Brady or Cutelaba or Ankalaev to get her in your lineup. But I still think that's a decent pivot in your high-risk contest, at least worth looking at. Decent aggression here and a decent chance for a finish. The last one here for the female fights, Alexa Grasso taking on Ji Yeon Kim. Grasso 9,100 on DraftKings, 18 on FanDuel, 1.6 times on SuperDraft. Kim on the run back, 7,100 on DraftKings, $11 on FanDuel, 2.35 times on SuperDraft. I think this is the worst fight on this card, probably. It's a pure stand-up affair. We only have one takedown between these two women in their entire UFC careers. They are aggressive striking, so Kim throws the most strikes overall, but her accuracy is so bad at 33% that she only lands the 8th most strikes. And Grasso's fourth in strikes, but she also just has 41% accuracy in the striking department. Neither of these women has scored well in decisions. This fight is minus 365 to go to a decision, so highly likely here. But just in the off chance we get a finish in this fight, it's going to be extremely contrarian. And, just in your high-risk contest, it's at least worth considering for that reason. There's a ton of opportunity cost with Grasso at 9,100. Kim, if she pulls off the upset, she'll be a decent score, I believe. But again, we're just talking high-risk contest here, fights you might want to take a look at that are going to be super low-owned. And the last fighter, we talked about Alessio Di Chirico being a decent target just because he is 7,800 and he's a favorite. But on the other side, Zach Cummings at 8,400 on DraftKings, 15 on FanDuel, 1.95 times on SuperDraft. Not only is he an underdog at 8,400, but he's one of the least aggressive fighters on this slate. 2.47 strikes per minute, 0.75 takedowns on average. 8,400 again, it's a pricing error. But one thing to just look at with Cummings, he has a 74% finish rate. This fight is minus 215 to go to decision, so it's not really one they're expecting a finish in. But in the off chance you do see one, Cummings is not going to be owned by basically anyone here. We know Chirico is the more aggressive fighter. But if you're just looking for pure leverage, Cummings certainly fits that bill. But to kind of recap this, your most aggressive fights are going to be Ankalaev, Cutelaba, Patolo, Kasanganay, Brady, Aguilera. I think those are great places to look. For chalk, I think we're looking at Rakic, Ankalaev, Brady as some of your most aggressive fighters, your highest owned fighters. However, they're all expensive. So people are going to have to look at some underdogs. Patolo, Chirico, Whitmire, maybe even Neil Magny. Those are some guys I think the field will look to. And there's places to get leverage. If you're just looking for straight pivots off of the expensive fighters at the top, I'd take a look at Lamas, some of the female fighters, and even Cummings if you're getting super, super risky in your high-risk contest at 8,400. He's not aggressive. He's an underdog. He's 8,400, but no one's going to touch him. But that's the slate. Thank you guys for watching, of course. For more information, check out Awesemo.com. We have weekly MMA passes available. We also have a ton of free content, including Thursday's MMA DFS strategy show. We also have a Saturday show prior to the fights. Those are absolutely awesome. Awesemo also recently released the Fantasy Football Draft Kit. It is August. Fantasy football season is upon us, so make sure to check that out. Otherwise, if you have questions, I am on Twitter at Matt_Gajewski. Best of luck to you out there, and enjoy the slate.